So, good morning, everyone. Let me see. Hi, yes. So this picture, I think some of you probably recognize. It's a picture of Ephesus. And Ephesus is an example of a wonderful city. If you haven't visited, I definitely recommend it. But it's an example of a city that didn't adapt. It's a little bit of a reminder for all of us. You know, we face an existential challenge in the cement industry to change from what we've been doing historically to something that is effectively zero carbon. And when we think about that transition, this is what happens if we don't make the transition successfully. So I'd just like to give you a little bit of an introduction to the World Cement Association, and then talk about the EU ETS, and then the challenges that CBAM presents to exporters to the EU, and then maybe finish up with some key issues that the cement industry more generally faces. Yeah, so the World Cement Association is a not-for-profit organization. We're founded in London about 5 or 6 years ago, 2016. And our members are stakeholders for the cement industry as well as cement producers. So we have engineering companies, technology providers, and others that are members. And our mission really is to help our members to have a more successful business. And today, really the key things that we try to do, the first is to share knowledge so that our members can improve their operations, reduce their costs, improve profitability. And the second is to help members to think through what the challenges are with decarbonization and how to adapt to those. And as an example of one of our services to improve the cost and the operational efficiency, we have a multi-company benchmarking activity we call Pegasus. And we look at, it's very hard when you compare data from different companies, because even though you try to standardize the measurements, they're probably not exactly standardized. But we can use that comparison to identify the opportunities to share best practice and to learn from the best practice of the best performers. And there's a number of examples here of the kind of activities that we have focused on. Another activity that we've got coming up on December 13th, which is open to everybody, is going to be talking about CBAM in a lot more detail. So I don't claim to be an expert on CBAM. I try and share what I think are the key points. But we have on December the 13th a webinar so that is open to all of the industry, all of the cement industry, which will incorporate a couple of experts on CBAM. So if you have really detailed questions, then I do encourage you to sign up for that. So if we look at the EU ETS, when this first came out, I was working for Holcim, and I remember us doing an analysis of how much carbon pricing was going to cost the industry. So this is very much the mentality that the industry maybe still has today. So in other words, if the carbon price is $50 a ton, and we've got 800 kilograms per ton of clinker emissions, it's going to cost us $40 per ton of clinker, and then we multiply out by our clinker production, and we compare that to our current EBITDA, and we say, we won't make any money at all. Yeah, so this was basically the analysis that Holcim did, said we won't make any money at all when we have carbon pricing. Now, I'm sure that many of you know that that's not really the way that it's worked out. And in fact, in the EU, cement companies have been making a lot of money in the last few years and have benefited from the ETS pretty much throughout its life. So I'll get onto that in a bit more detail in a moment. But this graph I have on the right-hand side here shows the trend in the carbon pricing in the last couple of years or 3 years. So you can see that we've gone from somewhere around $50 in 2021 to 50 euros, sorry, up to 90 euros in 2023. And the forecasts are that this will increase by about 10 euros per year. So that by the time we get to, let's say, 2034, we'll be at 200 euros per ton. Now, I'd have to say that forecasting this is extremely difficult because there are a lot of moving parts and changing regulations. But I think everybody believes that the carbon price is going to increase significantly, at least in the next 10 years, if not more. So this is a question really, I think, is whether or not this has been effective. But I come to that in a second. So the ETS, I'm sure you know, it's the carbon trading system for Europe. It has very detailed rules about how it works to try to prevent companies from cheating on that, although there have been examples of that already. And the basis for protecting the EU producers from having these higher costs from carbon has been to issue free allocations. So if you were a cement producer in Europe, then depending on your historical production, you'd receive free allocations, and you would only have to buy carbon credits if you needed more than your allocation. So if we look at the history of this, you can see these light blue peaks to the bars show where the cement industry had more free allocations than was necessary. So in this period, after the financial crisis until about 2017, there was the cement industry was issued with more free allocation than it needed, and was therefore able to sell these additional carbon credits. And the estimates are that the European cement industry made about 5 billion euros of profit from doing this. Now, I'm sure that the designers of this policy did not intend it to be a benefit scheme for the cement industry, but that's really what has happened in that period of time from 2008 to 2017. And then from 2018, we started to get a situation where the free allocation was no longer sufficient because the basis for making the free allocation is reduced over time. And so at this point, the cement industry started to purchase carbon credits on the market, and that's why you start to see the upward trend in the pricing of the carbon emissions. So although the industry has no longer got enough free allocations, so is actually having to pay money for the carbon credits, the impact of that has not been to reduce profitability. So I'm based in the UK, and our cement prices today in the UK are about £160 a ton. This is a delivered price, but so about $200 per ton. Now, clearly, at $200 per ton, everybody is making a lot of money. So this is a graph of the allocations, the free allocations, and the evolution of the CO2, or the average CO2 emissions per ton of clinker. And as you can see, there's a big gap now, 102 kilograms, between what is issued as free allocation and what is needed by the industry. And so this is leading to a cost. And I have a graph later where we'll look at what is likely to happen to those costs. But at the moment, these costs only are being paid on a very small proportion of clinker production. But the pricing, of course, the market pricing is set based on marginal costs. And at the margin, the cement companies are paying these carbon costs. And this is why we have these very high prices. And so the impact of this on the profitability of the cement industry in Europe has been very positive. So I think my key message about the ETS or carbon pricing systems is that this is not something the industry should be afraid of. We don't have too many examples, but the example we have in Europe has been extremely positive for the cement industry. So if we look forward and we look at the rules associated with CBAM, which I'll get into in a second, the amount of money that the industry is actually paying on carbon credits is going to dramatically increase. So you can see on the previous graph there was that gap of 102 euros per ton in terms of the free allocation versus what is needed. And over time, as the free allocation is phased out and CBAM comes in, that will become 100% of your actual emissions. And so if you take the forecast carbon prices and the changes in the rules over the next 10 years, you can see that for European producers, but this is not only European producers, this will be anybody who is selling into Europe, whether you're producing there or not, you're going to have this rapidly increasing cost of carbon, from less than 10 euros today to about 170 euros in 10 years' time. So the impact of that is we're going to see some closures. We already have seen some closures in Europe, but we'll certainly see more closures in Europe. There's a huge capex requirement. If you look at the cost of carbon capture and storage installations, the estimates are that they're more than perhaps as much as 1.5 or 2 times the cost of actually building the cement plant. So we're talking about a huge amount of capital investment that's going to be needed. But there are still opportunities to reduce, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but clearly the clinker factor at 77% is still relatively high, and there's still an opportunity with LC3 and other things to reduce that. I think another factor that we'll see is greater substitution of cement, either with non-concrete alternatives like CLT, timber, or with geopolymer concretes that are not using cement. But anyway, one way or another, we're going to be looking at higher prices and probably lower demand. So if we look at CBAM, CBAM is this new mechanism that the EU has, which is a way of protecting EU-based industry, EU-based producers from competition from outside, from producers who are not paying an equivalent carbon price. And it covers these various industries, including cement. So the CBAM actually starts operation in 2026. But I think the urgent thing to note is that the reporting requirements start from next January. So if you're exporting to the EU, then you will need to file a report, your first quarterly report, in January next year. And the penalties for not filing are very substantial. So it's not really that the CBAM tax is starting next year, but if you're not organized and reporting properly, then that will cause you to be taking a risk of substantial penalties. So there's these in-scope emissions for the short term, for the transitional period, are Scope 1 emissions. If you're buying clinker, then also it includes the Scope 3 emissions from the purchased materials, and then indirect emissions, so power emissions from the Scope 2. Later on, there's an intention to include all Scope 3 emissions, but this is supposed to start in 2026, but this is an extremely difficult thing to do. And of course, in the cement industry, it doesn't actually make a very big difference. Most of our emissions are Scope 1 and 2. So this is the phase-in of CBAM over the next 10 years. And you can see that when it starts in 2026, it starts at only a 2.5% tax. So if for every 100 tons of carbon emissions that are embodied in the products you export to the EU, you only have to pay the tax on 2.5 tons. But as you can see, after a few years of staying pretty low, it then rapidly escalates, becoming 100% in 2034. And on the reporting requirements, you'd be glad to know I'm not going to go through this in any detail. My point really with this slide is there are a lot of reporting requirements, and if you're not over the details, then you're taking a risk, and you're taking a risk of the penalties that can be imposed. And these penalties start in the reporting phase, so it's not in 2026. These start in 2024, in January. And there's a penalty of 10 to 50 euros per ton if you fail to report according to the rather detailed protocols. But in addition to that, if you repeatedly do this, there are various other taxes that, or fees that can be imposed, including banning your importation into the EU, or even getting you to pay the whole tax on 100% of the carbon emissions. So these penalties are extremely serious penalties. And I have a little concern in talking to various people in the industry that maybe not everybody is fully prepared for the reporting requirements. I was talking to somebody who's spent months trying to understand these regulations, and he said that you could cover the entire screen with printouts here, and you wouldn't be able to fit all of the regulations onto the screen. So there are a huge amount of regulations that need to be mastered, and the reporting needs to be consistent with those. So it really is a big job. And I'd like to close just by talking about the industry more generally and some of the challenges that we face. So as I said to start with, we're an industry in transition, and I think it helps to think of it this way, because if we just think of it incrementally, we may miss the bigger picture. So in 2050, we're going to be producing cement probably pretty much worldwide with zero or very, very limited carbon emissions. You know, this is going to look quite different from the cement industry that we know today. So some of the plants that today are very competitive, that have good positions with respect to limestone and markets and scale, are not necessarily the ones who will be the most competitive in the future. So if you're lucky enough to be sitting in a hub where carbon can be used, and maybe as a feedstock to the petrochemical industry, because the petrochemical industry also has to go post-carbon. So if you imagine a petrochemical industry that is not getting its carbon from fossil fuels, where is it getting the carbon from? Maybe one source is the cement industry. But if you're sitting somewhere where chemical industry or others can use your carbon, then probably your cost, or perhaps even you can get a price for it, but anyway, your costs are going to be, relatively speaking, very low. If you're sitting in a place that has a storage hub where a number of industries have invested in the infrastructure to store CO2, for example, under the North Sea, then maybe the costs there are not too high. But if you're sitting on your own in a position that maybe looked pretty good in the past, you might find that your cost of disposing of carbon make you completely uncompetitive. So this is really going to change the industry landscape. I think another thing to consider is the clinker cost is going to get much more expensive. Whether we decarbonize or are paying an ETS fee, then one way or another we're going to be paying a high price to decarbonize clinker. And that's going to affect the price of cement. I don't think that this is going to make a big difference in the overall demand, because even if we double cement prices, it only has a very marginal impact on construction costs. But when you look at it the other way, okay, you want to build this building, and how am I going to build it? Then I think it starts to look, especially when you also have a pressure on you with carbon footprint. So in London, for example, we now have planning rules coming into force that require developers to calculate the carbon footprint of the buildings they're proposing to build. And the acceptable standard for that is going to be reduced by 40% in the next 10 years. So you can see that there will be pressure on the ultimate consumers, the developers, to reduce their carbon footprint. And this is going to go through the supply chain. So both from a carbon standpoint and a cost standpoint, they're going to be looking at what are the alternatives to cement. So we will see some replacement, well, at least of clinker and possibly of cement in the materials that are used for construction. I think also there's a lot of cement that is wasted. Product standards are pretty conservative. Construction standards are pretty conservative. When the engineers do the calculations on, how much to use, they're pretty conservative. And then, when you get onto site, the guy on site, he's worried that the formwork hasn't been done perfectly, and maybe it's going to bow a little bit, and he probably needs more concrete to fill it than the drawings say, so he's going to overorder. So all the way through this chain, you've got people who are essentially using more concrete than they really needed to. And there are very good reasons for that in the past. If you do the economics, everybody's a rational actor. They're doing what makes sense. But when you start to share data more effectively with BIM, with building information modeling, or other forms of digitalization, then you can really address that. I think we'll see a reduction in wastage, which will also affect demand. If you talk to customers, and the cement industry is not very good at talking to the end users, talking to developers and even contractors, so we don't do that nearly enough. But if you talk to them, a lot of contractors are very frustrated that they can't get lower carbon products, that they can't get products with better circularity. And I think this is it's a threat because these contractors also have resources. They can also think about getting into the business. So we've seen in the past that contractors get into the concrete business. And generally speaking, this is not so good news for the cement industry. But if they start getting into the materials business more generally, then that becomes a bigger threat. So I think there is a greater willingness on the part of developers to get involved with the cement industry earlier in the project. In the past, they'd say, well, it's not very much, we don't really care, you're going to provide us with standard products, why would we talk to you? It just makes life more complicated. But today, that attitude is changing because of the impact that the cement will have on the footprint, the carbon footprint of the building. So in terms of the impact on price, it depends where you are, but something like 2% of the cost of a building is the cost of the cement. But if you look at the carbon side of things, then maybe a third, or perhaps even more than a third, is coming from the cement. So there's a much greater willingness on the part of developers and contractors to engage in conversation with the industry. But if we go back to them and say, well, you can have any one of our standard products, it's really kind of encouraging them to look elsewhere. So I think we need to be very careful about that. So just looking at something that we also we do, but we tend to be a little bit narrowly focused on things like product standards. There's more need to engage with government and governments around the world. With the cement industry, because our carbon footprint per dollar of revenue is probably 4 times more than the number 2 product, which is steel. We cannot move very far without having the right incentives. Otherwise, we put ourselves out of business. So it's very important that we engage with governments in order to get in place the right kind of systems. So one example is public procurement. On a global basis, governments buy more than half of the cement and concrete that's used. So public procurement can make a big difference. If procurement models are favoring low carbon materials. That can help create the market for low carbon materials. It can help to make projects viable, de-risk projects. Carbon pricing, as I mentioned earlier, despite the carbon pricing in Europe, Europe has had a real boom in profitability. And there's an opportunity there, I think, in other countries, especially in light of CBAM, to think carefully about how these...
Last 3 minutes, Mr. Riley.
Thank you. To think carefully about how these carbon systems are structured so that it encourages the development of a sustainable industry. And I think the biggest change we have to make is in seeing this as an opportunity, is in seeing this transition as a challenge for sure, but an opportunity to put the industry on a better footing. So here in Turkey, you have a massive overcapacity. It's by no means unique. We have massive overcapacity in most countries in the Middle East. We have a huge overcapacity in China and the prospect for a very substantial reduction in demand in China over the next 10 years. The industry is, in traditional terms, is going to be really struggling with overcapacity. And carbon pricing and the transition is a tremendous opportunity for us to move to a new sustainable structure. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions later.
Yes, any question? Arkadaşlar, herhangi bir sorunuz varsa 2 dakikaya yakın bir zamanımız var. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.